Early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing over. After 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. Joshua said to the priests, take up the ark of the covenant and pass on ahead of the people. So they took it up and went ahead of them. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so that you may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the ark of the covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river. Joshua said to the Israelites, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe, and as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. So, when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the ark of the covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is in flood all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So last week, Helen spoke to us from Joshua chapter 1. We looked at this new generation, this new leadership, and God's promise to be faithful to the people in the future, just as he had been faithful to them in the past. And he challenged them to be strong and courageous as he called them into this new phase of life together. And in the weeks ahead, we're going to be looking at the people of God as they breach the walls of Jericho, that great city that they're about to encounter, and they exercise obedience even when it seems absolutely crazy what God is asking them to do. We're going to look at that time when God holds the sun in place and the sun stands still as God fights on behalf of his people. And we'll see that prayer makes all the difference, even in the face of terrible odds. And then finally, at the end of the series, we'll look at the example of Caleb, one of those two spies, now an old man, who at the end of his life doesn't say, oh, look, I've had enough of all this fighting. This life of faith is too difficult now. I'm a bit decrepit. Give me something easy. He says, see that hill? That's the most difficult mountain to take, isn't it? Give me that hill. That's the one I want, even now in my dotage. And so we'll be looking at how can we cultivate that kind of attitude of faith, no matter what age we are, that still we want to do the most challenging thing that we can for the Lord. Exciting? Today, we're looking at moving in. We're going to have the next slide. And I wonder, have you moved recently, or can you remember when you did move? What was it like when you moved? When you got the keys for the first time? When you opened the front door? Maybe you grabbed your spouse and carried her in, or him in. Maybe it was that moment where there were just boxes everywhere. I remember when my brother moved from university, where was it? Hang on. No, that's right. He moved from a placement in a church where he had a whole house to a theological college where he had a room. And he said he got in and he put all his boxes down and there was no room left for anything. He had a slight moment of despair, so then began to organize himself and moved all the boxes around and stepped back and realized that still it looked exactly the same. There were just boxes everywhere. And then he broke down and cried for a little moment, pulled himself together and organized his life. Perhaps like that, it was like that for you. Maybe for you, you moved into this new house and you had a lot of work to do on the house. Perhaps the staircase was in the wrong position, or there was no floorboards upstairs, or no toilet downstairs, or the wallpaper was just from the 1970s, and you just thought, I need to do something about that. And you realized that actually you bought the house, you moved in, but that process of making it a home was going to take some time and energy and effort. And I wonder, as you were going through that process, how you felt. Perhaps you felt excited. At last, I'm moving in. Relieved, perhaps, that long process of buying a house had come to an end and you'd made it and no one had gazumped you. Or perhaps you're just looking at it feeling somewhat concerned that you've taken on too much and you feel a bit anxious about that. Well, you know, for the people of God in this passage, it's exactly the same. And it's the same for us as a church as we contemplate moving to 2 morning services on the 11th of October. So we're going to look at 3 things today as we think about moving in. You're on your own. You need to get your feet wet. But we need to stick together. So let's look at that first idea that you're on your own, verses 1 to 8. And you might think, well, that's a funny thing to say, Rod. What do you mean? Because actually, what you see in this passage is the Ark of the Covenant is kind of moved into center stage by the writer of the book of Joshua. It has this central role in the story. It's mentioned 17 times in chapters 3 to 4. So it's really clear that the writer doesn't want us as his readers to lose sight of the importance and centrality of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, why is that? Well, I think and commentators seem to think there are 2 reasons for that. One is just to remind us that God is still in the midst of his people. He's the prime mover in this story. He's the main actor, the main player. He's the initiator that makes things happen. But the second reason is that the people of God need to learn to trust the ordinary means of grace. The ordinary ways that God works. If you think about it, they have been relying on the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud for 40 years. That's pretty awesome, isn't it? Every day, every night, boom, right there. You don't really need to exercise much faith when God is manifesting himself right in front of you like that, do you? You have no doubts whatsoever because there he is. But that's gone. That's disappeared as they've reached the promised land at last. And we move from the cloud and the fire to the Ark of the Covenant carried by the priests. We move from the supernatural, if you like, to the natural, from the extraordinary to the ordinary. And that's not what they're used to as the people of God. And more than that, verse 4 says they are to keep their distance from the ark. So the people of God on the shoreline of the River Jordan, they watch the priests walk away from them into the river carrying the ark. They have that sense that the leaders have gone on ahead of them. And I wonder have you ever thought how that feels both for the leaders and the people? Because for the leaders wandering off into the middle of the river carrying the ark, that must have felt quite lonely, don't you think? Only 12 of them, everybody watching. They were doing something that seemed slightly mad. And that's often the case with the leadership, and maybe you found that in your own leadership, that there's a leadership gap where you've stepped out and others haven't quite stepped with you, and you're thinking, come on, and they're thinking, what are you doing? And it's lonely. You're out ahead. But actually, it can also feel quite lonely for those who are following as they watch their leaders going off into the distance. I wonder when you felt like you were on your own. A bit like being dropped off at school, perhaps, for the first time this term. Or being left behind at university, and your parents drive away and you wave. And you think, this is it. I actually had to tell my parents to go because I didn't think they were ever going to do it when I went to university. But what God is saying to the people here is, look, now it's up to you. I'm with you, but it's up to you. They hadn't been this way before. It was new, it was different, it was unfamiliar, and it was disconcerting. But this distance that the people of God have, it does something good. It gives them perspective. It gives them a wide-angled lens so they can see the big picture. They can see everything that's going on. So they saw what was happening further up the river. As the priests walked into the river, it was further up that it began to pile up. They could see that because they were at a distance. They could see what God had begun to do, and that encouraged their faith as they were called to follow the priests into the river. Now, what's our wide-angled lens that allows us to see that perspective? To put what we're doing on the 11th of October into the context that's right for it? Well, I think it's the story of God's mission that this story from the book of Joshua is part of as much as our story is a part of. It's a story of God's creation, a good creation, a creation to be loved and cherished. It's a story of decreation where humanity walked away from God, the forces of sin and evil broke into the world, and there was fracture and fragmentation and decreation. And it is a story of recreation as God's kingdom breaks back in and he reclaims his world for himself through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the work of his spirit-filled people of God. That's the story we're part of, isn't it? And we've seen that ourselves as St. Peter's, as his missionary people planted from Christ Church on the Hill to reach this community, to reach this town of Harrow. Not just to enjoy ourselves up here, but to go beyond our walls, to minister to our community, to see it transformed, to see culture changed, to see lives turned upside down and inside out by the gospel. And that's what we're still doing. Because the whole point of moving to 2 services is simply to make more room for those who don't yet know Jesus, for those who are far from him, so they can experience what we have experienced for themselves. And I think the big picture, when we get that wide-angle lens, it helps us to understand the change that we're experiencing in its context. But, having said that, do you notice how God doesn't tell them very much? Who is a fan of the Great British Bake Off? Be honest. Yes. I have to sit through it on a regular basis. I quite enjoy it when I get into it, but I try and avoid it as best I can because of its addictive properties. But the technical challenge is very interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's so unfair, because they give them a list of instructions, a recipe, if you like, and it's incomplete, isn't it? It's like minimal detail. Make the bread. And then you can see them kind of like, what does this mean? I don't know if I'm doing this right. Mixing it up. They have no idea. They don't have enough instructions. And it's because they're testing their existing knowledge. They want to know whether they have expertise or not in this area. So it's a really tough challenge. And I think the people of God here have a similar challenge. God gives them just enough information, but no more than that. It's a kind of need-to-know basis. So in verse 6, look, Joshua says, "Take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on ahead of the people." So they took it up and went ahead of them. That's all. And then verse 8, flick over the page. Well, on my Bible it is. "When you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river." That's it. There's nothing else. It's incomplete. And change to some degree or another is always like that. We don't have all the facts at our fingertips. There are no assurances, no guarantees. We are genuinely stepping into the unknown. But God knows that's how we develop faith. And that's why the people have to prepare. Verse 5, Joshua says, consecrate yourselves. And I wonder whether you've been doing that yourself as we prepare for this date on the 11th of October. Have you been preparing yourself spiritually, giving yourself a spiritual health check, facing your fears, and consciously moving from fear to faith, ensuring that your heart is soft and rejecting that kind of cynicism and skepticism and unbelief that the enemy easily kind of drops into our minds? Because what Joshua offers the people is God's extraordinary promise. It's an incredible promise. He says, tomorrow you will see the Lord do amazing things among you. Do you believe that? I really believe that. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. And that's why God repeats the promise. So verse 10, he will certainly drive out your enemies before you. You're on your own. Second thing, you need to get your feet wet. I wonder how you've pictured the River Jordan when they are crossing the river at this point. I have to confess to you that I've always pictured it as something of a brook. And so, the priests, they kind of walk in, and maybe the water's up to their knees. Definitely no more than that, yeah? That's not unreasonable, is it? That's all it is. Okay, I'm in, and they're stood there in the middle, and they're just waiting for it to drop down a little bit. And it's pretty easy. But then you get this horrendous verse, which seemed to kind of stick out from nowhere, in verse, where is it? Let's see if I can find it. Verse 15, now the Jordan is in flood during all the harvest. Now that kind of breaks the flow of the narrative and the suspense that the writer's building up. So why is it there? Well, he wants to understand the significance of the action of these priests, the craziness of God's plan for his people. Because the Jordan is in flood. And the floodplain of the Jordan was between 200 meters and a mile wide. It was packed with bush and jungle growth, so it was really quite hard to walk through. The river itself could be 90 to 100 meters across, and it could be as deep as from 3 meters to 12 feet. And you can imagine how fast-flowing it was because it was going downhill. There was a gradient. This was like white water. This was rapids. This was a torrent, a raging torrent, a fast-flowing river. And it was the worst time to cross it. And the truth is, isn't there, that there's never a good time for change, really, for any of us. We're never ready. We never feel ready. But God here chooses this moment. He chooses the worst moment. He doesn't delay it. He doesn't wait. And then he does something different. Do you see here how it's nothing like the crossing of the Red Sea? You may have seen the movie, where Moses hits the staff on the ground and the water goes. It's so powerful, it's amazing. And the people could see it. Brilliant. There's the pathway, and there's the big whales in the walls of the water on either side. Absolutely wonderful. Really easy. I'm going to go through it. Not so this time round. So for the people, the priests here, there's a raging torrent in front of them. They're told to walk into it, and as they do that, nothing happens as far as they're aware. Because actually, quite a distance away upstream in Adam, the water's beginning to pile up, but they have no idea about that yet, so they've got to keep going, pushing through this raging torrent. They're wading in, carrying the ark together. How do you think that felt? Pretty tough, pretty scary. What is God doing? And slowly but surely, and only slowly but surely, do they begin to feel the effects of what's going on upstream as the water subsides and dies away. It's a bit different from how we picture it in our minds, isn't it? Imagine how they felt. Maybe they felt foolish. They just dived into this raging torrent and nothing had happened. They certainly felt anxious. But you notice they had to wade in. They had to get their feet wet. In the face of the flood, they were called to step in, to step out, and to step up all at the same time. God doesn't clear the way. The miracle hasn't happened yet. They have to play their part. They have to put themselves in harm's way. They have to take the risk to look the fool. It wasn't easy for them. It's not easy for us. Because I know for some of us, it's very difficult to imagine what 2 morning services will look like. How that will change our routines on a Sunday that have been the same for many years. How will the teams work? How will we do coffee? When will I need to get in to help out? Which one will I even go to? I don't know. But I think this passage is saying to us, guys, we have to get our feet wet. God hasn't this time chosen to part the waters. He's piled them up upstream. And it's only when we say, yes, I'm in, here we go, that we will see God moving. But actually that might take time. And we need to be patient and we need to hold our nerve. So we need to get our feet wet. Thirdly, we need to stick together. In the midst of all of this, the good news is that all of Israel got across safely. The whole nation. See, no one was left behind. Even the stragglers, even those bringing up the rear, they made it across. Whatever it took, however long it took, they made it. And sociologists will tell you that people process change at different paces, different speeds. And you have the change adoption curve, which looks like a big bump. And you have the pioneers and the innovators. There's only about 2% of them in an organization or group or community of people. They get it quick. They move quick. They love change. They're in straight away. Then you get a group of early adopters, about 14% of them, who will get there just a little bit more slowly. They're positive. They quite like change too. Then you get the early majority who have some questions, some queries, some anxieties, 34% of them, but they get there next. Then you get the late majority, another 34%. They'll get there eventually, but it takes them time. They're comfortable, they like what they know. And finally, you get the laggards, which I always think is a really unhelpful term for those who find change particularly difficult. But that does seem to be the technical term, and there are 16% of them. And some of them will never quite make it. And Joshua has already experienced the laggards, the Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh. They say to God, look, we don't want to cross the river. We want to stay where we are. Can we do that? And he says, yes, you can do that, but you've got to play your part. So you need to send your fighting men to be in the front line with the rest of us. And they say, okay, we'll do that. You can see that in chapter 1. But the critical mass there as the people move together, move forward together, comes with the early majority. And so, if you're not quite sure yet how this will all work for you or where you fit, don't worry. That's okay. Because every community needs its pioneers, but you know every community needs its settlers too. We're in a pioneering stage, just like Israel was here. And we need to navigate that together. But just as the people of God entered into the promised land and needed to settle that land, it will be precisely the same for us. But what God makes very clear to all of the people of God, however they're feeling about that change, is that that change is worth it. There's Jericho still to conquer. We'll look at that next week. There are hills still to be taken. There are enemies to be killed. The tribes remain in the land. But this is the land that God promised the people of God. And so he says, it's worth remembering that I've brought you to this place. Chapter 4 is all about that, remembering that moment. That it's significant and momentous, it's historic. And so they pile up together 12 stones where they've crossed the river as a permanent memorial. And perhaps this is our time. Perhaps this is the inflection point, the tipping point, where we move to a new level. That's certainly my prayer, and I hope it is yours too. So just to draw things together, 3 things. You're on your own. God works on this strange need-to-know basis. So we don't get the full picture. There are no guarantees, but we need to get ready. So how are you preparing your heart? You need to get your feet wet. Nothing happens if you stay on the shore. So you need to wade into the river, raging torrent though it may be. So I want to encourage you, throw yourself into one of those new services. Even if it's just like, I don't know, I'll pick one. Do that. Throw yourself in. And thirdly, stick together. We are in this together. We are moving at different paces. That's absolutely fine. But try and take one step forward today, just one pace. And we will all get there together because it's worth it. So how can we do that? Well, I'd love us to think about 4 responses. Choose, serve, give, and pray. Choose, serve, give, and pray. Choose a service. The 9:30 is going to be exactly the same as this one, but the kids' church is going to lean towards those who are under 5 because they tend to get up early. I have 3 kids under 5. They get up very early. The 11:30 service is going to be exactly the same as this one, but the kids' church is going to lean towards those who are over 5. Because when they get a bit older, they like to lie in, don't they? And what we're going to do in a moment, we're going to have communion. We're going to share communion together. And I'd love you to come forward to receive bread and wine and bring your bag with you if you have one. And as you come forward to receive as the people of God, as we participate in that corporate act of worship as the body of Christ together, if you're going to join, if you're going to choose the 9:30, go back and sit over here. Wherever you're sitting now, go and sit over here. Okay? And if you are going to choose the 11:30, go back to your seat after you've received communion and sit over here on this side. Okay? So that's one thing I'd love you to respond in. Choose a service. And then if you like, you might want to pray with those that are around you. Second thing, serve. Have you joined a team? Are you a member of a team on a Sunday? Because all of us need to play our part. It is absolutely all hands on deck. So we have welcome teams, cafe teams, worship teams, kid church teams. Let me give you an example. The cafe team, we're dividing it into 3. So rather than the current, you do the whole lot when you're on cafe team, we're splitting it into 3 so that if you come to the 9:30 service, you can come a little bit earlier. You can make the coffee. So it's all ready. It stays hot for hours in these new pots that we're getting. Or if you don't want to come that early, you can come. You can serve coffee between the 2 services. That's all you need to do. Just serve the coffee. You don't need to make the coffee because it's already been made. Just serve. And then you don't need to put the coffee away because if you come to the late service, you might want to stay behind a little bit afterwards to wash up and just to make sure the coffee pots are really clean. Brilliant! Less work for everybody, but probably we need a few more people to help with that. So how are you going to serve? Thirdly, give. So in 2 weeks' time, we are going to have a gift day. Very exciting. We only have 2 of those a year. It will only be the second time I've spoken about money while I've been here. And we are aiming for £15,000 in one-off gifts. Last time we raised 20,000. Let's see if we can do 15,000. We are also hoping to see 50% of you, the congregation, giving regularly. Because at the moment, we have less than 50% giving by standing order. And we really believe that giving is just a natural part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So we'd love to see that go up. And we'd love to get to a place where average giving actually hits about 10% of our income, if we can. So choose, serve, give. 2 weeks, gift day. You'll hear more about that as we get closer. And lastly, pray. It is 1 month until the 11th of October, where we launch these 2 new services. Wouldn't it be great? I'd love it if all of us together could every day pray for that endeavor. Pray for that launch. Pray that God uses those two services to make room for those who yet do not know Jesus, but one day will do so through the ministry and outreach of this church. Amen? Amen. Why don't we stand?